My marriage was barely 6 months old at that time, and it was supposed to be a fresh, exciting start. But out of nowhere, a bolt of lightning struck the peace of my otherwise routine life. My husband, Tom, made an unexpected request, one that would change everything. He wanted me to take care of his father, who had become bedridden after a terrible accident. This was my first experience with caregiving, and I was completely overwhelmed. As someone who had never cared for anyone in such a serious condition, I struggled at first, unsure of how to manage his father's needs while juggling my own life. But that wasn't the worst of it. Tom had other plans. "We're going to Hawaii for a break," he told me. "You stay here and take care of my father." I was left behind as Tom and his mother flew off to relax in Hawaii, unaware of the kind of emotional and physical toll their decision would bring. Let me take you back a little. My name is Mary, and I'm 30 years old. I've always had a passion for cooking, which led me to pursue a career in the culinary industry. After graduating from college, I landed a job with a major restaurant chain. Over time, I rose through the ranks and now oversee the development of new products in the planning department. It's been 8 years since I started, and I've built a solid career for myself. But amidst my busy work life, I also had a chance at love. 2 years ago, I visited my favorite Japanese pub alone to unwind after a long day. I sat at the counter, where I found myself chatting with the pubmaster. That's when I noticed him, Tom, sitting right next to me. He was warm, funny, and easy to talk to. We learned that we were the same age, and through a casual conversation, we exchanged contact information. Tom began inviting me to dinner regularly, and before I knew it, we were spending more and more time together. His upbeat personality and kind nature drew me in. I felt the same way about him, and naturally, we started dating. A year later, we got married. It was a beautiful ceremony, and we were happy. We lived together in an apartment located conveniently between our workplaces. Despite the busy schedules, we always made time for each other. I often cut corners with housework because we were both working long hours. But Tom never seemed to mind. He'd always smile and say, "You don't have to be perfect at housework. I'm just happy being with you." He would also tell me, "I wish you could take more time to prepare dinner, but I'm just happy to have dinner with you." His words meant the world to me, and I felt incredibly lucky to have someone so caring. "I like to treat the people I love with kindness," Tom would often say. And I couldn't agree more. Our love felt so effortless, and even 6 months into our marriage, we had moments of pure happiness, laughing together like we did when we first met. I thought this bliss would continue forever. But as life often does, it threw us a curveball. One evening, I came home from work to find Tom sitting in the living room, already there when I arrived. Normally, I'd be the first one home, but that day, something felt off. There was a heavy silence in the air. Tom's face was tense, and he was on his phone, deeply engrossed in the conversation. I could tell something was wrong. "Tom, are you okay?" I asked, my voice filled with concern. He looked up at me, his expression startled, like he hadn't even noticed I'd walked in. "Oh, hey, Mary." I'm just a little out of it," he replied. "My mom called. My dad had an accident." The words didn't quite sink in at first. My mind raced, trying to process the information. "What happened? Is he all right?" I asked, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on me. Tom took a deep breath. I don't know yet. We need to go see him," he said, his voice shaky. We couldn't just sit there. We had to act fast. I reached for his hand, urging him to get moving. "We need to visit him, right now," I said, feeling an urgent need to be there for his father. But then, Tom's response left me shocked. "We can't go." "Not right now," he said, his voice filled with an unfamiliar coldness. "What do you mean? Is he not feeling well?" I asked, confused. Tom looked at me with a sigh. "No, we don't need to go. Mom is staying with him until he gets better." I couldn't believe it. My heart sank as I realized that their priorities weren't where I thought they'd be. This wasn't just an accident. It was a sign of the emotional distance that had already started to form in our lives. "Oh no," His words made me realize there was nothing I could do at this point. I let go of Tom's hand and sat down on the sofa, feeling the weight of the situation sink in. I couldn't help but worry about my father-in-law's well-being. "I'm concerned if he's okay," I muttered, looking up at Tom for reassurance. But he remained silent. His quietness only heightened my anxiety, and the unease I felt grew stronger by the second. My father-in-law had just turned 65, and he had always taken great care of his health. He loved going hiking, golfing, and staying active on his days off. He was always full of life, a man of energy and vitality. So, to hear that he was now in this condition was unimaginable. Tom, too, had been deeply affected. My father-in-law wasn't just my husband's father. He was also the president of the company where Tom worked. This must have been a huge blow for Tom, and I could see how perplexed and distant he was. I couldn't fathom how he was coping with the sudden change. His usual cheerful demeanor was replaced with sadness and uncertainty. I wished I could reach out to him, but I felt as if a wall had already begun to build between us. A week later, we were finally able to visit my father-in-law in the hospital. When I walked into the room, I found him lying in bed, his smile weak and tired. My heart ached at the sight. "Are you all right?" I asked, my voice soft, but I could tell it didn't carry the confidence I wanted it to. My father-in-law scratched his head apologetically. "Mary, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cause you concern. But I'm not upset. I'm just relieved to see you," he said slowly. He paused and gave me a weak smile. "I'm glad you're here and safe." I felt a sense of relief wash over me when I heard those words. I could see that, despite everything, he was doing his best to reassure us. "But please stay in bed for a while and rest," I urged, trying to be the supportive daughter-in-law he needed. He smiled again, and I felt a surge of comfort at seeing his smile. But the reality of his situation hit me hard. My father-in-law had suffered a severe spinal cord injury in the accident, and he was paralyzed from the waist down. His recovery would be a long road. He would remain in the hospital for the next 2 months for rehabilitation and assessment. Even after his release, he would require continuous rehabilitation. While my father-in-law was in recovery, Tom made the decision to temporarily step into his father's shoes and assume the presidency of the company. It felt strange, almost surreal, to see my husband in such a powerful position. But I knew he had no choice. Someone had to take charge. Still, it was an odd shift for me. I never imagined that just 6 months into our marriage, I'd find myself supporting Tom in such a significant way. It was one thing to deal with personal challenges, but to manage a company at the same time? That added a new layer of stress to an already difficult situation. Tom was adjusting to his new role, balancing his responsibilities with his need to care for his father. I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, and I wanted to help, but I felt increasingly isolated. That was when my mother-in-law arrived at the hospital. I was sitting in the corner, watching Tom and his father have a quiet conversation, when she summoned me over to a secluded part of the room. "Hey, Mary," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Are you sure you're not mistaken?" I looked at her, confused. Mistaken about what? She narrowed her eyes, her voice sharp. "Just because Tom is the president doesn't mean you can take advantage of him. Don't think I haven't noticed." Her words hit me like a slap in the face. I wasn't sure how to respond. "I don't have to take advantage of anyone," I said, my voice steady despite the surprise and hurt I felt. "I'm employed, and I'm well compensated." My mother-in-law scoffed. "Sure, but you knew that Tom was the boss's son when you married him, right? How vile." I was taken aback by her harshness. I hadn't expected this kind of animosity from her, especially not now, in such a vulnerable moment. I could feel the tension between us growing thicker, and I realized that, perhaps, my place in this family was not as secure as I had thought. My mother-in-law smirked as she delivered her words, matter-of-factly. But they were nothing more than her imagination, not reality. I had never realized Tom was the president's son until we had been dating for a while, and by then, it had already become irrelevant. My mother-in-law, however, didn't share that view. Since the beginning of our marriage, she had been sarcastic toward me, constantly undermining my intentions. I didn't want to be misunderstood, so I snapped at her on the spot. I didn't marry him for his money, I said, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and frustration. Tom's personality captivated me, not his wealth. What are you on about? She scoffed. You speak to me as if you know who I am. Her tone was biting, but I wasn't about to back down. That's right. Nothing would be misunderstood by you, I replied. But whatever you say, I will never approve of you. Her eyes narrowed, but before she could retort, my father-in-law, perhaps noticing the tension, asked, "What's wrong?" My mother-in-law glared at me, her voice sharp as she responded, "It's nothing." Her words and actions made it clear that she adored Tom, perhaps to an unhealthy degree. She probably believed I was just another woman after her son's money, especially since we had married after only a year of dating. Her attitude toward me had been ruthless from the very beginning, even at our wedding. I had greeted her with a smile, hoping for her approval, but I had received nothing but disdain in return. What hurt the most was that Tom, the person I loved and trusted, seemed to be blind to his mother's behavior. In fact, he often seemed to adore her as well, troublingly so. His devotion to her seemed to outweigh any sense of empathy he might have had for me. A few days later, Tom said something that made my stomach drop. "Mary, you're aware that my father will be released from the hospital next month, right?" he began. "He'll be coming back to our parents' house at that time." I froze, trying to make sense of his words. "Wait a minute," I said. "Why are you suddenly saying this?" My mind raced, unsure of where this conversation was headed. Tom sighed, as if the answer should be obvious. "It was suggested by Mom. She said this is a good time for us to move in together. Mom can't live with Dad by herself, and it's not easy to do that quickly. We're all in this together, Mary." I stared at him, feeling a wave of disbelief. "What?" I managed to say. "You're all in this together?" "I never agreed to this, Tom. I still have work and responsibilities of my own." But Tom was unmoved. "Mom says to me that she's so thankful you're agreeing to this. So, just pack your things and get ready to move in." I was completely taken aback. "Wait," I said, "if we move to your parents' house, I won't be able to commute to work. We barely managed to find an apartment near our workplaces." Tom waved off my concerns. "It's only 5 stops by train from my parent house. You're very fortunate to have the chance to sit on the train in the mornings." It became clear that Tom and his mother had already made up their minds. The decision had been made without me being consulted, and I was expected to just comply. I asked Tom several more times if we could avoid moving in together, but he ignored my requests. His devotion to his mother only grew stronger, while his words and actions toward me became more harsh and dismissive. Once we had moved into Tom's parents' house, the situation quickly became overwhelming. Tom's behavior continued to deteriorate, and I felt like a stranger in my own home. Every day, he would lecture me about something. "How's the packing going?" he'd ask, his voice cold. "I won't be able to take time off work on the day of the move, so you'll fill in for me, okay? You'll be in charge of all household duties and looking after my mother. Don't make her suffer." Even before the move was completed, I felt mentally and physically exhausted from the constant demands. The company was in the midst of a busy season, and I was juggling both work and moving preparations. I barely had time to breathe. 2 months later, the move was finally completed, and my father-in-law was released from the hospital. But instead of relief, I found myself thrown into a new role, the caregiver. I had to get up at 4 a.m. every day to prepare breakfast and do laundry simultaneously. After that, I would help my father-in-law with his morning routine, massage his limbs, and change his clothes. By the time I finished all of that, I was barely able to make it to work. I didn't have time for myself anymore, and the house was constantly in disarray. Despite all my efforts, my mother-in-law was never satisfied. She would frequently try to prevent me from leaving in the morning. "Mary, do you have a minute?" she would ask, her voice dripping with passive aggression. "I apologize, but your breakfast was not to my liking. You'll hear about it when I get back." I would try to explain that I had to leave, but she would cut me off, commanding, "Don't argue with me. Just sit there. You're not going anywhere." Her yelling would start my day on the wrong note. The stress and constant criticism took a toll on me. I started having heart palpitations and headaches whenever she or Tom gave me unreasonable demands. It felt like I was drowning in their expectations, with no way out. I had never been late to work before, but now, because of the constant verbal abuse and mental exhaustion, I was always barely on time. My coworkers started noticing, and I could see the concern in their eyes. But I didn't have the strength to explain. 3 months had passed since my father-in-law left the hospital, and the pressure never seemed to let up. There was no time to catch my breath. Every moment was filled with housework and caregiving. As soon as I came home from work, I had to prepare dinner for everyone, always under a strict deadline. My husband, however, always found something to criticize. "What's the deal, Mary?" he scorned, looking at the fish I had hurriedly prepared. "I come home exhausted, and you want to have fish? Are you sure?" I tried to explain, my voice strained. I had to leave the kitchen to clean up after my father-in-law. I made boiled fish because that's what I had time to prepare. Tom wasn't having it. "You should make something that will increase my stamina." "I'm not interested in boiled fish." I stayed silent, trying to suppress the frustration building inside me. I watched as Tom took out a cup of noodles and filled it with hot water. My mother-in-law stood nearby, smirking as she watched the situation unfold. Feeling crushed, I went to tend to my father-in-law, changing his clothes for the evening. He must have noticed my exhaustion because he looked at me with concern. "Mary, you're looking pale. Are you all right?" he asked, worry in his voice. "I'm fine," I replied, trying to reassure him. "I've just been a little preoccupied with work." "Is that it?" "I've been hearing a lot of yelling from you and Tom lately," he said gently. "It's entirely my fault. I'm not particularly talented in many areas." I couldn't help but smile at his self-deprecating comment, though it pained me. "You don't look like that at all," I said, forcing a smile to keep up appearances. The truth was, I had reached my breaking point. I had always wanted to leave, but the thought of abandoning my father-in-law made me hesitate. He needed me. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the question, what would happen to me if I stayed in this toxic environment? I knew that something had to change, but I didn't know where to begin. As the end of the year approached, I finally had a few days off from work. But even then, I was still stuck doing house cleaning, running errands, and caring for my father-in-law. Then, on New Year's Eve, Tom made a statement that shook me to my core. "My mom and I are heading to Hawaii," he said, looking pleased with himself. "What? Hawaii?" I stared at him, unable to comprehend his words. "You've spent so much time discussing this with your mother? What about your father's?" "He's fine," Tom replied, as if the answer should be obvious. "He's okay with us being here. You're off work, so you should take care of him. We're going to unwind in Hawaii." Tom and my mother-in-law showed off their large carry-on cases, clearly delighted by the trip they were about to take. They found my confusion amusing, suppressing their laughs as they prepared to leave. "Well, you're going to take care of my father while we're away," Tom said with a triumphant grin. "We'll be relaxing in Hawaii, so you'll have to handle everything yourself." As they left, I stood frozen in the doorway. I had reached my limit. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when they treated me like a servant. Something inside me snapped. That evening, as I sat quietly, a new resolve began to form in my mind. I was done. I couldn't keep living like this. I would take care of my father-in-law while they were gone, but when they returned, I would be gone. I decided to file for divorce. The next morning, I went about my routine as usual. I made breakfast for my father-in-law, helped him get dressed, and assisted him with his morning needs. As I entered his room, he smiled at me, clearly trying to lift my spirits. "Mary, best wishes for the new year," he said warmly. "Happy New Year, Dad," I replied, forcing a smile. "What happened to Tom and my wife last night? They seem to be in some sort of trouble." "They went to Hawaii," I answered. "It's all paid for by the company." My father-in-law sighed, looking skeptical. "Hawaii? What? Why would they go there?" I smiled faintly, shaking my head. "I don't know, Dad." But my father-in-law wasn't fooled. He knew something was wrong, and he had plans of his own. "I've been able to stand on my own for a few days now. Thanks to your help, Mary. I've been waiting for the right moment, But I never imagined it would happen like this. He paused, then continued. I'm not going to let them push you around anymore. My father-in-law, it seemed, had been watching everything unfold from the sidelines. He had made his own plan. While Tom and my mother-in-law were away, my father-in-law reached out to a company executive who informed him of Tom's irresponsible behavior at work. It turned out that Tom and his mother had been using company funds for their vacation, and the company's board was furious. My father-in-law had been planning to return to the company as president after the new year, and Tom was supposed to step down. But now my father-in-law had made a decision. He would fire Tom for his behavior. Mary, my father-in-law said, a twinkle of defiance in his eyes. The house is in my name. I've already made some changes to the locks, and we've devised a strategy to keep them out when they return. I didn't know what to say. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of hope. A week later, the front door shook, and the intercom rang repeatedly. Tom and my mother-in-law had returned from Hawaii, and they were trying to open the door. Good to see you back, I said into the intercom, trying to keep my voice neutral. How was your journeys? What the heck, Marys? Tom demanded, his voice angry. Please open the door right now. We can't get in. That's something I can't do, I replied calmly. My father-in-law warned me not to open the door. What are you talking about? Tom asked, confused and furious. I smiled as I watched their expressions through the monitor. It was almost satisfying to see them so bewildered. How did you find out about the trip? My mother-in-law hissed. How did you know it was paid for by company funds? I chuckled, unable to hold back. Oh, you really embezzled my company's money? Dad, why aren't you supposed to be able to stand? My father-in-law, who had been listening to the conversation from the side, interrupted. I've been able to stand for a few days now, thanks to Mary's help with my rehabilitation. And the managing director has informed me about your shady behavior at work. No, Dad. Nothing was done by me. Tom's voice was frantic as he realized the gravity of the situation. Give it up. I haven't done anything wrong. His words were desperate, but it was too late for any kind of pleading. My father-in-law's decision had already been made. You've been fired, he declared coldly. You inept piece of trash. Pack your belongings and leave my office immediately. Through the monitor, I watched my husband as he began to plead with me, tears filling his eyes. Mary, you won't leave me, will you? I snapped back at him without hesitation. The years of frustration and pain poured out of me in a single moment. What are you talking about? Do you have any idea how I've felt since you decided to live with your parents without my permission? You took advantage of me, along with your mother, and forced me to care for your father, as if it were my duty. Do you even realize how hard it's been for me? Tom's face went pale, and my words hit him like a ton of bricks. Oh, calm down, Mary. I'm sorry, he stammered, trying to reach for me. But it was too little, too late. Your apology is worthless, I said firmly. When you left for your trip, I understood. It's a waste of time to keep the family going with you. I'll live on my own. I don't want a coward like you in my life anymore. At my words, Tom backed away, stunned and speechless. I didn't see Tom or my mother-in-law again after that day. Rumor has it that they both ended up unemployed, unable to afford even the simplest accommodation. Word spread that they were forced to sleep in a comic book cafe, working day jobs just to scrape by. It was a stark contrast to the comfortable, privileged life they had once lived. But honestly, it was a punishment they deserved. After the divorce, my father-in-law came to me with a kind smile. I'm going to hire a housekeeper from now on, he said. So you're free to go. You deserve a fresh start. I couldn't believe it. After everything I had gone through, he was offering me the chance to rebuild my life. I took him at his word, and soon after, I moved to a place closer to my work. It was a modest apartment, but it felt like a sanctuary, a place where I could finally breathe freely, without the weight of abuse or manipulation. Now, I'm living a comfortable and fulfilling life, one that I could never have imagined when I was trapped in that toxic marriage. I cannot thank my father-in-law enough for saving me. He not only gave me the strength to stand up for myself, but also provided me with the opportunity to start over. I'm determined to repay him in any way I can. His kindness and support are things I will never forget, and I will spend the rest of my life showing my gratitude. En-law rushed to support him, her face twisted in frustration and disbelief. It was like watching a painful scene of a mother and son desperately trying to salvage something that was already broken. In that moment, my father-in-law opened the front door and walked toward them, holding the divorce papers in his hands. With a calm but resolute voice, he handed them to Tom and his mother. "Fill them out," my father-in-law commanded. "Do it now." There was no more room for negotiation. My husband and mother-in-law were stunned but helpless, and they filled out the divorce papers as instructed. As soon as the papers were signed, I walked to the door, kicked them out, and locked it behind them. They continued to plead through the door, banging on it and calling out, but my father-in-law never answered. He stood beside me, strong and unwavering, as we watched their cries fade into the distance.